A decorated surgeon is sentenced to life in prison for a brutal murder he insists he didn't commit. But when a hidden trail of evidence emerges years later, it exposes a conspiracy that shakes the medical and legal systems to their cores. The courtroom was packed that day in Fairview, California. The air was heavy, not just with the tension of the verdict about to be delivered, but with the whispers of a community divided. All eyes were fixed on Judge Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose reputation for being both fair and unrelenting had made her a fixture in the town's justice system. At 63, with nearly 4 decades on the bench, her piercing blue eyes and stern demeanor could silence even the rowdiest courtroom. At the defense table sat Dr. Nathan Greer, a once-renowned cardiac surgeon whose life had unraveled in a matter of weeks. His broad shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of his orange prison jumpsuit, and his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. Despite his disheveled appearance, his eyes burned with a quiet resolve. Dr. Greer had maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest, insisting he had no involvement in the murder of his estranged wife, Laura Greer. But today, his protests seemed futile. "Dr. Greer," Judge Hayes began, her voice firm and steady as it cut through the murmurs in the courtroom, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for the murder of Laura Greer. Your actions were calculated, malicious, and have left an irreplaceable void in the lives of her loved ones." In the back row, Nathan's teenage daughter stifled a sob, clutching a photograph of her parents from happier days. She had pleaded for leniency, begging the court to remember the man who had saved countless lives, not the accused killer they claimed he had become. But the evidence had been damning. Traces of Nathan's DNA at the crime scene, emails revealing heated arguments, and neighbors who testified to hearing loud disputes in the weeks leading up to Laura's death. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her gavel in hand. "I hereby sentence you to life in state custody without the possibility of parole." The sound of the gavel striking the oak block echoed, like the final heartbeat of hope. Nathan didn't flinch. His lips pressed into a tight line, and his gaze never wavered. As the bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom, his daughter's cries followed him, mingling with the murmur of spectators and the frantic scribbling of reporters. In the judge's chambers, Hayes poured herself a cup of black coffee, staring into its depths. The day had been long, but justice, as she understood it, had been served. Yet, a faint unease lingered, an inexplicable whisper of doubt she quickly pushed aside. Months turned into years. Nathan adjusted to life behind bars, though he never stopped proclaiming his innocence. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes continued her work, her days filled with hearings and verdicts. The Greer case was just another file in a sea of convictions, or so it seemed, until a package arrived on her desk one crisp autumn morning. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a stack of documents and a single note scrawled in hurried handwriting. "You sentenced an innocent man. Look closer." Hayes frowned and began leafing through the papers. They included an alternate timeline for the night of Laura's murder, witness statements that had never been presented at trial, and security footage from a gas station showing Nathan miles away from the crime scene. Her heart pounded as she flipped to the last page. A police report implicating a man named Charles Weller, a private investigator Laura had hired before her death. Alarmed, Hayes contacted Detective Martin Ford, a retired investigator she had worked with on numerous cases. Over coffee in her kitchen that evening, she laid out the new evidence. Ford's face darkened as he scanned the documents. "This isn't just a mistake," he said gravely. "This is a setup." Together, they began to dig. Ford uncovered records showing that Weller had been under investigation for blackmail and evidence tampering in another case. Witnesses who had testified against Nathan recanted their statements, admitting they had been coerced. Even the DNA evidence that had tied Nathan to the crime scene was revealed to have been contaminated in the lab, a discovery made by a whistleblower who feared retaliation. But the most damning evidence came from a bank account linked to Weller. It showed large deposits made shortly after Laura's murder, transferred from an account belonging to her business partner, who stood to gain significantly from her death. The deeper Hayes and Ford dug, the clearer the picture became. Laura's murder had been a calculated act of greed, and Nathan had been the perfect scapegoat. Hayes filed a motion to reopen the case, attaching the evidence she and Ford had uncovered. The motion sent shockwaves through the legal community. Some praised her courage, while others accused her of undermining her own judgment. Threats began arriving at her home and office. Anonymous notes warned her to drop the case. Her car tires were slashed, and a brick was thrown through her office window. Despite the backlash, Hayes pressed on. The boy she had once sentenced deserved justice. The courtroom was packed again when the case was reopened. This time, it was Nathan's defense attorney who presented the damning evidence against Weller and Laura's business partner. The crowd gasped as surveillance footage played, showing Weller entering Laura's house the night of the murder. Hayes sat motionless, her face a mask of composure, but her heart ached with regret. When Nathan's conviction was overturned, the courtroom erupted in applause. He stood, his eyes glistening with tears, as his daughter ran into his arms. For Hayes, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the system she had devoted her life to had failed in the most profound way. She vowed to spend the remainder of her career fighting for reforms that would ensure no one else suffered Nathan's fate. As for Nathan, his story didn't end with his release. He became a fierce advocate for the wrongfully convicted, dedicating his life to helping others find the justice he had almost lost forever. Their story served as a stark reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth has a way of rising to the surface, demanding to be seen.